the key thing to understand about statistics is how unbiased or biased the data can be that's presented to you. Oftentimes what you want to consider, and we've talked about this a little bit, you want to consider who is conducting the study, if they already have a predetermined idea of what the study should be and what the answer to the study should be, the conclusion of the study should be, and if they are trying to get you to think a certain way, or are they just providing regular data and you draw your own conclusion. Anytime statistics are presented to you, you should consider that, of any type. And especially these days on social media, people pass stuff off as fact or truth when it may have an angle already built into it. So before you make a conclusion about whatever it is you're seeing, you want to consider all of those other facts. Okay, so let's just kind of keep that in mind as we're working through this today. All right. So, yeah, I would write that all out, or type it, whichever. Oftentimes we see the misuse of statistics to sell things, to try to make money, try to get you to buy stuff. Sometimes they're trying to prove something that is true that might really not be true. It's misleading. Or, and especially in this day and age, and especially in this country, oftentimes we do things to scare people into behaving or acting in a certain way, and trying to get them on their side or believing a certain way to sway your opinion. Okay? And so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about be really careful when you're presented with statistics and understand that where it's coming from is something important to consider. Are they trying to get you to act one way or another? Are they trying to get you on their side or against somebody else? Right? We see that in the political ad season all the time, which wasn't that long ago. Right? We don't necessarily just see candidates getting up there to talk about how great they are. Oftentimes they're in ads slamming somebody else. Okay? Or there's statistics that are presented that are biased or slanted, or maybe they're not fully disclosed. So my point, or the biggest point that I want to make in 1.5 is having a decent level of skepticism when you see statistics is important. And it takes time on your end to do some research of the research so you can make your own conclusion for yourself. Okay? Are there any questions about that idea? So let's talk about different ways that this can happen. Okay? So one of the ways that statistics can be misused is when the sample is suspect. Okay. And I'm going to give you a bunch of different ways that a sample could be suspect. One of the ways that a sample can be suspect is a really small sample size. And I'm going to use Bishop Verot as an example, and I'm going to try to as best I can. For our purposes, we have about 680 students at the school. If I was taking a survey and I sampled 10 students and was trying to make some decision on something, is that a fair representation in all likelihood of our entire school population? No, probably not. Okay, it could be slanted, it could be biased. It's probably not going to be representative. Could it be? Sure, it could be. But the likelihood that it is probably small. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Right? The other type of suspect sample is volunteers. People who are eager to give you their opinion. They have time on their hands and they want to share everything they think with you. Okay? Doesn't mean that their opinions are bad or wrong or anything like that. It just, again, could be slanted. It could have a bias to it. Another type might be gender specific, particularly when it's regarding an idea that affects all genders. If it's a research study conducted to gain information about females, then that's a different story, okay? But if it's something that we want to apply across the board to all genders, we probably better include all genders in the survey and the research. And lastly, we have a convenience sample. And I've talked about this one before in here. If I wanted to get a poll from just my statistics class 7th hour about whether or not we should leave campus for lunch, because it's easy for me to do, it's probably not going to be very reflective of the rest of the school. Now, you guys would be all for it, and you wouldn't object to it, but if I was a freshman, or the parent of a freshman, I'm not so keen on the idea of letting my kid leave school for lunch, right? So, when it's convenient for the researcher, oftentimes it can have a bias. So we got to be careful with those kinds of samples. So when you're presented with data and you're trying to draw a conclusion from that data, it helps to know this information. And you don't always know it. You don't always know who is a part of the study when you're presented with data, especially on social media. Because social media, you're just boom, boom, boom to the next thing. And if you just get a bunch of numbers thrown in front of you, it's hard to draw a conclusion without knowing whether or not this is true. Okay? I'm trying to create some skepticism for you. The idea is when you're presented with data, you shouldn't just say, oh, then therefore this must be true. Because it might not be. Okay? Because it might have some of these things in play. Ambiguous averages. Talk about what that is. When it comes to statistics, we talk about something called measures of central tendency. And later on this year, we will look at that a little more closely. But if the researcher uses the measure of central tendency that helps support the position they want you to have, then that's not completely fair. It's not giving you all the data. Now, does anybody remember what measures of central tendency are? Do you know what I'm talking about here? There's 3 of them that we're going to really kind of focus on. Yeah?
Is it like the median, the center, and then
Median is one of them, yes.
center, like bell, whatever, and then
Yeah, that has a name too.
I can't.
What? Mean. The mean, median, and the mode. Those are the 3 main ones. Range is in that conversation too. And there's some other ones. But when we're talking about measures of central tendency, we're talking about that. You know, it's interesting because in some studies they'll present you, well, the mean of the data, the average of the data. That's what the mean is. In some situations they'll present you the median of the data, which is the number in the middle. Or the mode, which just happens the most times. Okay? If I'm an advertiser trying to get you to buy a product, I might, instead of presenting all 3 of the numbers to you for you to make your own decision, I might present only the number to you that's going to help sell my product. And now I've provided this quote-unquote evidence that supports the reason why you should buy this. Okay? Again, you got to look out for that. Another one is they'll just change the subject in the middle of their argument. Currently, people that have political conversations with each other, and I'm not going to tell you one side or the other. I'm not going to favor one side or the other. Okay? But this tactic happens a lot. Instead of staying on task and staying on subject and talking about what the actual issue is, people will just change the subject and say, well, what about them when they did it that way? Well, that's not even what we're talking about. But people do that all the time, right? So, for example, here might be a claim that a politician makes. During my administration, expenditures increased a mere 3%. What word is key here? Mere. What are they trying to get you to think? It's like, it's only 3%. Like, it hardly went up at all. No big deal. It's just a mere 3%. 3% of what? Well, we don't know. That's the thing. 3% of what? Here's another way to look at the same kind of thing. Here's the opponent, right? This is how it goes. Expenditures have increased a whopping $6 million. Maybe that's 3% of the entire budget. Right? We've got some key words here that are used to get you to believe a certain thing. Now, on top of that, let's say that those numbers represent the same amount. Maybe 3% of the budget is $6 million. But if all you do is listen to this person, you're just going to say, well, it's just not that much. No big deal. At the same time, if you're listening to this person, you're like, $6 million? No way, that's way too much. Right? It's all twisted a little bit. It's all slanted a little bit to try to get you to believe a certain thing. Okay? And that's a tactic that gets used often with statistics because people use that kind of stuff to try to make you think a certain way, to draw a certain conclusion. Because they both could be true. It's up to you to draw the conclusion on your own. Next. Detached statistics. This is a good one. A claim that uses a detached statistic is one in which no comparison is made. Here's what this might look like. Something like this. Our brand of crackers has 1/3 fewer calories. 1/3 fewer than what? A donut? Like, or other crackers? Or, right? This kind of thing happens on stuff at the grocery store all the time. Trying to put some keywords or phrases that might entice you to purchase their product.
Isn't that like the one before? Because it said it only increased 3% and 3% more?
To some extent. But it's about perspective a little bit too. Okay?
It's like,
Yeah, when you see things like this, you've got to ask yourself, compared to what? If it said our brand of crackers is 1/3 fewer calories than Ritz crackers or whatever, all right, then fine. You got a pretty good idea. But sometimes they don't even bother to draw the comparison, and they're like 1/3 fewer calories. Well, geez, that means I can eat 3 times as many as I normally would. Well, one-third fewer calories than what? That's important to understand what it's being compared to. Again, if it's being compared to nothing, you should question it. You should be skeptical of that claim. Not to say that it's wrong. I mean, there may be a grammar mistake. Maybe they just left a word off, and it was a mistake. Maybe it does mean to be 1/3 less than Ritz. I don't know. But the fact is it's worth questioning. Okay? Alright, next thing. Implied connections. You got to be careful with the wording. This is may in some people or might. It's not definitive. You're meant to believe that it's supposed to happen that way, but it doesn't mean it will. It's qualifying itself. It's qualifying its own claim. They're even saying, you know what, it might not work for you. Every single commercial you see on TV that's selling some type of prescription medication has this in it. May reduce the risk for getting diabetes. Yeah, it may not. Might increase the risk for a heart attack though. Right? So all of those qualifiers, all of those types of words that aren't concrete could be misused. Next one. Misleading graphs. This one's the best one. I like this one the most. And the example I'm going to give you, if you want to take a picture of it, you can. Usually these are used when someone is trying to prove a point and make one thing look better than the other. Okay? Or again, get you to believe one thing or the other. Here's the graph I'm talking about. Alright, if I look at this, your first instinct is going, man, average class score. Mr. Jones' classes, those kids are dumb. Man, Mrs. Smith she's on top of it. Her kids are way brighter than Mr. Jones. Or Mrs. Smith's just a better teacher. Maybe Mr. Jones is a crappy teacher. Right? All of that you're supposed to think when you look at this, right? It appears that the scores, the average class scores in Miss Smith's class compared to Mr. Jones' class is dramatically different, right? And I guarantee you there are people that will look at that and go, well, I want my child in Miss Smith's class because their kids do better. What's the average score in Mr. Jones' class?
70.2.
What is the average score in Miss Smith's class? Is there even a difference?
0.8.
I mean, right, like there's not really a difference between that at all. There's a little bit of a difference. Miss Smith's average is a little bit higher by 0.8%. But if you go by the graph, you know, somebody wants you to think Mr. Jones doesn't know what he's doing, or his kids are dumber, or Miss Smith is amazing. And you see what I'm saying? This is a misleading graph. Okay? You have to watch out for that. Okay? A lot of times too you'll see a line graph that has part of the information not even there. Now, here's the other thing. If this scale would have started down here at 0, okay, and they included all the tick marks all the way up, it would look a lot closer, right? Because we'd see the entire bar from 0. So the fact that they started the bottom at 73 to begin with is one of the reasons this is misleading. That scale makes a big difference in what you perceive. Okay? And that's something else we want to watch out for. All right. And then the faulty survey question part. That's the other way that people can be misled. And this is one you're going to have to deal with soon. Well, you might have to deal with soon. But I will say this. How many of you voted in the last election? Anybody? Did you? Okay. So there were referendums, right? There were ballot measures on there that weren't just people. And they're super wordy. Did you read them?
Yeah.
And try to understand them and try to make sense of them? And some of it you can, and some of it you couldn't. Some of it is just real, like, gibberish, and they're trying to confuse you, right?
I just voted for what I understood.
Yeah. That's probably a good way. Don't, voting based on your own level of understanding education is probably the way to go, right? So let's look at an example here. Here's a question that is being posed to this particular school district. Do you feel that the North Huntington School District should build a new football stadium? That's the question. It also depends who you're asking, right? If you're a bunch of parents of a football team, you probably want a new football stadium. If all we're talking about is getting a new football stadium, we don't think about what the impact might be, most people are going to say, yeah, I'd love a new football stadium, that'd be great. But if we ask it this way, do you favor increasing school taxes so that the school district can get a new football stadium? Do you think people might think about the question differently? Okay. The first question doesn't ask about what it would take to get the new football stadium. It just wants to know if you want one. The second one now starts getting to the heart of what it's going to take. Maybe that changes your opinion, or maybe it changes your willingness to get the new football stadium. Maybe now, if you know that in order to get the new football stadium, you have to increase your taxes, maybe your answer to this question is actually going to be no. And the trick is it depends who's trying to get you to answer the question. Okay? And so how a question is worded may elicit two different answers, and they might be after the same idea. So again, the idea behind all that is to consider who is asking the question and what do they want to know that information for. So before you just jump in and volunteer your opinion, maybe consider what it's going to be used for and who wants to know. Or maybe you just need to ask more questions. Maybe you need to get more information. And that's the key with any of these surveys and these studies and these research studies. It's not that they're necessarily bad or, there's some type of mean angle to it or anything like that. Maybe you just don't have all the information. And you need more information before you can draw a conclusion. Okay? So that's the key. And in our social media world, where people try to get you to draw conclusions in split seconds. Right? So just be a little more pensive about it maybe, a little more skeptical, and get as much information as you can before you do go ahead and jump to a conclusion. Does that make sense?